Serafina had always considered herself a loyal and trusting friend. She valued the bond she shared with Sophie, even though she knew Sophie could sometimes be a bit too demanding. But they had been friends for years, and Serafina never questioned her loyalty until one fateful afternoon when everything changed. It was a regular Tuesday when Sophie called Serafina, her voice trembling with urgency. "Serafina, I need your car," she said, clearly panicked. "There's an emergency, and I can't get to the hospital without it. I swear I'll return it as soon as I can." Serafina hesitated for a moment, but the panic in Sophie's voice was enough to convince her. Sophie had always been dramatic, but Serafina trusted her, so she agreed to let her borrow the car. "Just bring it back soon, all right?" Serafina said, trying not to sound too worried. Sophie promised she would and hung up quickly. Hours passed, and Serafina waited. She didn't mind giving Sophie the car. It wasn't the first time she had lent it out, but as the evening wore on and Sophie still hadn't returned it, Serafina began to feel uneasy. She sent a few texts, asking if everything was okay, and when Sophie planned to return the car, but received no reply. "She's probably just caught up in whatever emergency she had," Serafina told herself, trying to shake off the growing feeling of discomfort. But as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, when Serafina woke up, she grabbed her phone, still hoping for an update. To her surprise, there was a new post on Sophie's social media. Serafina opened it without thinking. Sophie was sitting in a fancy restaurant, smiling wide, holding a glass of wine in one hand, and beside her, Serafina's car was parked perfectly in the background. Sophie looked relaxed, as if she had all the time in the world, and the supposed emergency she had mentioned seemed a distant memory. Serafina's stomach dropped. Her first instinct was to message Sophie, but something inside her told her to pause and think about this. She looked at the photo again, the caption showing Sophie laughing with friends, completely carefree, with no mention of any emergency. Serafina sat frozen for a few moments, disbelief and anger flooding her thoughts. She had trusted Sophie with something as valuable as her car, and now it seemed Sophie had used her generosity as an excuse to go out and have fun. Serafina's fingers trembled as she picked up her phone and typed a quick message. "Why didn't you tell me you were out last night? I saw your post." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Sophie's reply came just minutes later, but it was far from the apology Serafina expected. "It wasn't a big deal, Serafina. I needed to get out for a bit. The emergency was just—" "It's not a big deal anymore," Sophie wrote, as if brushing the whole situation off. Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. Sophie wasn't even acknowledging how much her actions had hurt her. She had used Serafina's kindness as a cover for something entirely selfish. The words on the screen blurred as Serafina tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was betrayal. Her mind raced as she considered her options. Part of her wanted to lash out, to tell Sophie how she felt. But another part of her knew that this was the moment she had been avoiding for so long. Sophie had always been a bit entitled, but Serafina had never really stood up for herself before. Now, it was time to change that. "I'm done with this," Serafina typed back, but then paused. Instead of sending something filled with anger, she deleted the message and took a deep breath. "We need to talk. Come over to my place, now." Sophie showed up at Serafina's apartment within an hour, and Serafina could see the casual, almost smug smile on Sophie's face as she walked through the door. She was still acting like nothing had changed. Serafina, however, wasn't going to play along anymore. "I saw your post last night," Serafina said, her voice calm but firm. Sophie froze for a second, her smile faltering, but then she laughed lightly, as if trying to brush it off. "Oh, come on, Serafina. You're really making a big deal out of nothing. I told you it was just a little getaway." Serafina felt her anger rising, but she kept it in check. "You lied to me, Sophie. You said there was an emergency, and now I see you having a good time with my car, like it's no big deal. Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" Sophie opened her mouth to say something, but Serafina cut her off. "You know what? I don't want to hear your excuses. You took my trust and threw it away. You knew exactly what you were doing." Sophie's face twisted in irritation. "It's just a car, Serafina. You're overreacting. It's not like I crashed it or anything." But Serafina could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier. It wasn't just about the car. It was about how Sophie had taken advantage of her, and that was something Serafina couldn't ignore any longer. As Sophie stood there, trying to justify herself, Serafina made up her mind. I want my car back. Now. Sophie stared at her, her expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief. You're serious, aren't you? She asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. Serafina met her gaze without flinching. Yes, I'm serious. And I'm done with you taking me for granted. Sophie stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Serafina stood in silence for a moment, her heart racing but also oddly lighter. She had finally spoken up for herself. She had drawn the line, and Sophie had crossed it. There was no going back from this. Later that day, Sophie texted again, this time more apologetically. I didn't mean to hurt you, Serafina. I'm sorry, but Serafina wasn't interested in apologies anymore. She had seen the real side of Sophie, and it wasn't one she was willing to ignore. The trust between them was broken, and Serafina knew she needed to move on. The next day, as Serafina sat in her living room, scrolling through social media, she saw Sophie's latest post. This time, it was a photo of her with a new car, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. Serafina paused, her finger hovering over the screen. But instead of feeling hurt or angry, she just shook her head and closed the app. She had learned something valuable. Sometimes, people showed you exactly who they were, and it was up to you to decide whether or not you wanted to keep them in your life. And for Serafina, it was clear that some people weren't worth keeping. She had given Sophie a chance, and Sophie had thrown it away. But Serafina had learned her lesson. From now on, she would protect her boundaries and her trust, no matter what. The following week was quiet, almost too quiet. Serafina had expected Sophie to reach out, to try and smooth things over or offer some kind of explanation. But days went by, and nothing. The silence was deafening, yet Serafina felt a sense of peace she hadn't anticipated. It was strange how much lighter she felt not having to deal with Sophie's manipulations anymore. There was no more guilt, no more wondering if she had done something wrong. For the first time in a long time, Serafina was focused on herself. The absence of Sophie in her life left space for new things to grow. Serafina had always wanted to take up painting again, but never seemed to find the time. Now, with a newfound sense of clarity, she enrolled in an art class. It was refreshing to be surrounded by people who had no preconceived notions about her and didn't expect anything. For the first time in a while, Serafina felt like she was doing something just for her. She painted landscapes, her thoughts drifting to wide-open spaces, clear skies, and calm waters. The act of painting became her way of expressing the freedom she had just begun to embrace. As the days passed, Serafina's thoughts about Sophie faded in the background. She had friends, sure, but none of them had ever tested her trust like Sophie had. It was becoming clear to Serafina that her relationships needed to be different from now on. She couldn't keep letting people walk all over her just because she was afraid of confrontation. It was time to start making decisions based on her own needs, not others' expectations. Then, almost a month later, she received an unexpected message from Sophie. It was simple. Can we talk? Serafina stared at the text for a long moment, wondering if it was worth replying. A part of her still felt that familiar pull to give Sophie the benefit of the doubt, to go back to how things used to be. But then another stronger part of her said no. She didn't need to go back to the way things were. She'd already moved on. Still, her curiosity got the better of her, and she responded with a single word. Why? The reply came quickly, almost too quickly. I want to explain. Can we meet? Serafina didn't know what to expect. Part of her didn't want to see Sophie at all, but another part of her, the part that had always believed in second chances, wondered if this conversation could offer closure. So she agreed to meet at a local cafe. When she walked in, she saw Sophie sitting at a table by the window, her face slightly tense, a contrast to the confident, carefree woman Serafina had once known. Sophie's eyes met hers as Serafina walked up, and there was something different about her, something vulnerable. Hi, Sophie said, her voice softer than usual. Thanks for agreeing to meet. Serafina nodded and sat down, unsure of what to say. There was an awkward silence before Sophie spoke again, the words coming out in a rush. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And I know I messed up. I shouldn't have lied to you. I shouldn't have used you like that." Her voice wavered, and for the first time, Serafina could hear real remorse in Sophie's words. "I was selfish, and I can't blame you for being angry. I I needed to escape for a bit, and I didn't know how to ask for that without making it sound like I was using you." Serafina listened quietly, feeling the weight of her own emotions slowly settle. She had been angry, yes, but now, listening to Sophie, she realized that Sophie had always acted out of insecurity, not malice. It wasn't an excuse, but it gave Serafina a better understanding of why Sophie had acted the way she did. "I've been selfish too," Serafina said after a long pause, "letting you take advantage of me. I've always put others first, even when they didn't deserve it. I think that's why I kept putting up with it." Sophie seemed to absorb this, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry, Serafina. I took you for granted. I've been trying to figure out how to make things right, but I know it's not going to be easy." Serafina sighed. The anger she had once felt was still there, but it was fading now. She wasn't going to forgive Sophie right away, but part of her understood that everyone made mistakes, and sometimes people could change. It was hard to trust Sophie again, but it didn't mean she had to keep holding on to the anger that weighed her down. "I'm not sure we can go back to what we were, Sophie," Serafina said slowly. "But I can give you a chance to prove you've changed. That's all I can do." Sophie nodded, her face sincere. "I understand, and I'll prove it to you." As they parted ways, Serafina couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not just between her and Sophie, but within herself too. She had stood up for herself, drawn her boundaries, and made choices that were best for her. It wasn't about forgiving Sophie right away, but it was about finding peace in her own heart. She had learned that the most important relationship was the one she had with herself, and no one could take that away. Serafina walked away from the cafe with her head a little higher, her heart a little lighter. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like her own. She didn't need Sophie to validate her, and that realization was freeing. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it on her terms. The weeks that followed were a blend of growth and reflection for Serafina. She didn't rush to forgive Sophie, nor did she harbor any resentment. Instead, she focused on herself. Every day, Serafina dedicated more time to the things that made her feel fulfilled. Whether it was painting, reading, or spending quiet evenings in her apartment, enjoying the peace she had worked so hard to reclaim. Her art classes continued to fill her with a sense of purpose, and each brushstroke on the canvas became a reminder that she was in control of her own happiness. Despite the distance, Serafina had the occasional thought about Sophie. She wondered if her old friend was truly trying to change, or if it was just another act to get back into her good graces. Sophie had apologized, yes, but Serafina wasn't sure if the apology was enough. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about trust, respect, and consistency, things that took time to rebuild. And Serafina wasn't ready to dive back into that kind of vulnerability without being sure of Sophie's intentions. One Friday evening, as Serafina was finishing a new painting, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophie. "I've been thinking about what you said. I've been working on being a better person. I hope we can start fresh." Serafina stared at the message for a while, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wasn't sure how to respond. Sophie had made an effort, but Serafina didn't want to rush into something she wasn't ready for. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about clarity. After a long moment, Serafina typed back, "I'm glad to hear that, but I think we both need time. Let's not rush things." She hit send, her decision final. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they told her that taking things slow was the best way forward. Sophie didn't reply immediately, and for the first time in a long while, Serafina felt at peace with that. The following days passed, and Serafina's life continued to unfold. She made new connections with people who didn't come with the weight of past mistakes. She went on hikes, attended a couple of art exhibitions, and even began to volunteer at a local community center that focused on youth art programs. There was something beautiful about giving back, and it felt good to be involved in something bigger than herself. But just as Serafina was settling into this new chapter of her life, Sophie reached out again. This time, it was a phone call. Serafina wasn't sure what to expect, but she decided to answer. "Hey, Serafina," Sophie's voice came through the phone, hesitating slightly. "I've been thinking a lot. I know I messed up, and I want to do more than just apologize. I've been working on myself, trying to figure out where I went wrong, and I wanted to ask if you'd be open to meeting again." Serafina's chest tightened. She had to admit, the sincerity in Sophie's voice was different this time. It wasn't the same deflection she had heard before. There was something raw, something real about her words. "I'm not sure, Sophie," Serafina replied, her voice calm but guarded. "I need to see if you're really serious about making a change, not just saying the right things. Actions speak louder than words." Sophie was quiet for a moment, but Serafina could tell she was taking the words to heart. "I understand. I've been working on making things right, not just for you, but for me too. I don't want to lose you, Serafina." Serafina sat back, considering her response. She could hear the change in Sophie's voice, the vulnerability that hadn't been there before. She thought about all the times she had let Sophie take advantage of her, about the broken trust, and about how hard it had been to let go. But maybe, just maybe, Sophie had changed. Maybe they could rebuild, but it would take time. "Let's meet next week," Serafina said slowly. "But remember, this isn't just about the past. It's about moving forward. If we can do that, then we can see where things go." Sophie agreed, her voice filled with relief. "Thank you, Serafina. I'll prove it to you. I won't let you down again." As Serafina hung up, she felt a mixture of emotions. She wasn't fully ready to dive back into their friendship, but she also knew that people could change if they truly wanted to. She didn't need to rush, and she didn't need to force anything. It was all about moving at her own pace, on her own terms. The following week, they met at a small cafe, the same place where they had once sat and talked for hours, back when their friendship felt simple and easy. The atmosphere felt different now, a little more distant, but with a sense of possibility lingering in the air. Sophie arrived early, and when she saw Serafina walk in, she stood up with a tentative smile. There was no grand gesture, no big apologies, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened between them. They sat down, and Sophie didn't immediately speak. Serafina didn't either. They simply exchanged glances, taking in the changes in each other. Sophie finally spoke, her voice quieter than Serafina had ever heard it. "I've made mistakes, Serafina. I know it's going to take time to rebuild our trust, but I'm willing to put in the effort." Serafina nodded, looking at Sophie with a mix of hope and caution. "I'm willing to give you a chance, but you have to prove it, Sophie. No more lies, no more games." Sophie's eyes were earnest. "I can do that. I want to show you that I'm serious. I don't want to lose this friendship." The conversation wasn't easy. It wasn't full of quick fixes or grand promises. It was a slow, deliberate rebuilding of something that had been broken. But as Serafina left the cafe that day, she realized something important. It wasn't about giving Sophie another chance for the sake of the past. It was about giving herself the chance to move forward, to decide how she wanted her relationships to look in the future. For Serafina, this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about reclaiming her power, her boundaries, and her peace. Whether or not Sophie would fully change didn't matter as much as what Serafina was learning about herself in the process. She was no longer afraid to stand up for herself, to set boundaries, and to walk away when necessary. And in that, Serafina found the strength to move forward, knowing that she was enough on her own, regardless of what anyone else did. Months passed, and with each day, Serafina grew more and more certain of her own strength. She was no longer the same person who had lent Sophie her car with no questions asked. The experience had changed her in ways she hadn't even fully realized at first. She wasn't just learning to set boundaries with others. She was learning to set them with herself too. Her life, once cluttered with doubts and people-pleasing tendencies, now felt clear and full of purpose. Sophie, for her part, had made genuine strides. She wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when her old, selfish tendencies would flare up, but she had shown up in ways Serafina hadn't expected. Sophie had made an effort to support Serafina's art, showing up to exhibitions and even volunteering at some of the community programs Serafina was involved in. The small gestures mattered. They weren't enough to erase the past, but they were enough to show that Sophie was willing to put in the work. One afternoon, Serafina received an unexpected call from Sophie. She hadn't been prepared for it, but something about Sophie's tone made her answer. Serafina, I've been thinking, Sophie began, her voice cautious. I've been asked to join this business venture, and they're looking for someone with experience in the arts. Specifically, someone who's passionate about helping artists grow. I thought of you. Serafina felt a wave of uncertainty. Sophie had always been about business, about appearances, about climbing the ladder. But this was different. Serafina didn't want to get her hopes up. What exactly are you asking, Sophie? I know I've made mistakes, and I'm not expecting you to jump in right away, Sophie said. But I'd like us to work together on this. I need your expertise. And this time, I want it to be on your terms, Serafina. I won't push you like I did before. Serafina paused. She wasn't sure what to make of Sophie's offer. It was tempting, perhaps too tempting. But she knew the risks. She didn't want to go back to the old dynamic, the one where Sophie used her as a stepping stone for her own gain. But there was something different about this conversation. Sophie wasn't asking for a free pass. She was offering collaboration. And that meant she was finally respecting Serafina's boundaries. I'll think about it, Serafina replied, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. But this has to be something we build together. No more taking advantage of my trust, Sophie. I need to know you're serious. Sophie agreed, and they hung up, leaving Serafina with a swirl of emotions. It wasn't a clear-cut decision. The idea of working with Sophie, especially on something as close to her heart as art, felt like a big leap. But Serafina knew that her decision had to come from a place of trust in herself, not in Sophie's promises. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about creating something new. And if it didn't feel right, she knew she could walk away. A week later, Serafina met Sophie at a small cafe, the same one where they had first started rebuilding their connection. The air was thick with the weight of their conversation. Sophie looked different, more grounded, less frantic. The nervous energy that used to surround her was gone, replaced by something steadier, more sincere. I've been working on a plan, Sophie said, as Serafina sat down, handing her a folder of documents. I've done my research, and I think we could make this work. We could help artists get the exposure they deserve, the support they need, and in a way that's not about exploiting them. I've been thinking a lot about the kind of legacy I want to leave, and this is it. I want to make things right, not just for me, but for everyone involved. Serafina took the folder and started flipping through the papers. The proposal was well thought out, much more detailed than she had expected. She could see the effort Sophie had put into it, but Serafina also noticed how it aligned with her own values. Helping artists grow, creating a space where people weren't just commodities. It was an opportunity that could make a real impact. And Serafina felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, she wasn't looking at Sophie through the lens of their past mistakes. She was looking at this project for what it could be. An opportunity to help people, to make a difference, and to work together in a way that felt right. This wasn't about rebuilding their old friendship. It was about creating something new, based on mutual respect and shared goals. I'm willing to give this a chance, Serafina said, looking Sophie in the eye. But only if we keep this honest. We move forward with integrity. No shortcuts, no more lying. Sophie nodded, a small smile creeping onto her face. I promise. This is a new chapter, Serafina. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it work. Serafina felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew that there were still risks. The path ahead wasn't guaranteed. But what she was learning more and more every day was that it wasn't about whether things were perfect. It was about the willingness to grow, to change, and to stay true to herself. And for the first time in a long time, Serafina felt ready to take a step into the unknown. She wasn't just taking a chance on Sophie. She was taking a chance on herself. In the coming months, their partnership began to flourish. Serafina could see the impact they were making. And for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of the work they were doing together. Sophie didn't always get it right, but Serafina was there to keep her grounded, to remind her of the bigger picture. They made mistakes, but they also celebrated the victories, no matter how small. And through it all, Serafina never lost sight of the most important lesson she had learned, that boundaries, honesty, and self-respect were the foundations for any relationship to thrive. And as their business venture continued to grow, Serafina realized that, in the end, it wasn't just about what they had built. It was about what they had learned along the way. That even broken things could be transformed. That forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, and that the greatest strength lay in knowing when to walk away and when to walk forward with someone who had earned your trust again. As Serafina's business venture with Sophie continued to grow, she found herself in a new phase of her life, one that felt more balanced, more aligned with her values. The venture they had started together was flourishing, with Serafina focusing on the creative side, helping artists showcase their work, while Sophie handled the business logistics, always consulting Serafina before making any major decisions. Their partnership, though still cautious, was slowly evolving into something genuinely collaborative. But even as things seemed to be falling into place, Serafina couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unresolved between her and Sophie. It wasn't that she hadn't forgiven Sophie for the past. It was more that she hadn't fully understood what had happened in their friendship. There were still moments when Sophie's old manipulative behavior would slip through, though these moments were fewer and further between. Sophie would get frustrated, maybe act a little too self-centered, or make a snap decision without consulting Serafina. Each time, Serafina would take a step back, reminding herself that this wasn't the same person she had once known. One evening, as they wrapped up a meeting at their office, Sophie turned to Serafina with a more serious expression than usual. "Can we talk about something personal?" Sophie asked, her voice softer than normal. Serafina glanced up, surprised by the change in tone. She had been getting used to their easygoing working relationship, but this felt different. "Sure," she replied, her voice calm, but her curiosity piqued. "I know I've been working hard on myself," Sophie started, her hands fidgeting nervously. "But I realize now that I've been avoiding something we never really talked about. I need to apologize, not just for borrowing your car, but for everything. For not being the friend you needed me to be, for taking you for granted, for using you when it was convenient." Serafina's heart skipped a beat. She had expected an apology, but this wasn't what she had anticipated. Sophie was being raw, open in a way that felt vulnerable. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just the weight of regret in her words. "I've been thinking about how I treated you, and honestly, I've never really taken responsibility for it. I hurt you, Serafina, and I'm sorry," Sophie continued, her voice tinged with emotion. "I know I can't erase the past, but I want you to know that I'm working on being better. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again, but I can promise that I'll keep trying. I just want you to know that I value you, both as a partner in this business and as a person." Serafina sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing Sophie's words. She could see how much this moment meant to Sophie, how far she had come since their first conversation. Part of Serafina wanted to say something, to offer reassurance, but another part of her needed time to process the depth of the apology. They had come so far, but there was still the matter of trust to rebuild. "I appreciate your apology, Sophie," Serafina said quietly. "And I do see that you're trying, but it's not just about the apology. It's about the actions that come after. I need to know that you're really committed to making things right. Not just for me, but for yourself too." Sophie nodded, her face serious. "I get that. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that I'm serious. I've spent too much of my life avoiding accountability, and I don't want to do that anymore." Serafina couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. Sophie's words weren't just about the business or the car incident anymore. They were about a deeper understanding, a desire to grow as a person. In that moment, Serafina realized that while their friendship would never be the same, it didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. "I'm willing to give you a chance to prove it," Serafina said softly, "but it's going to take time. And it's going to require both of us to be honest with each other, even when it's uncomfortable." Sophie smiled, a genuine, relieved smile that reached her eyes. "I can do that, Serafina." Thank you. As Serafina walked home that evening, the city lights sparkling around her, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. She had spent so much of her life fearing that she had to fix everything, that she had to protect herself from being hurt again. But now, she was learning that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about understanding it, accepting it, and using it to build something stronger. The next morning, Serafina received an email from one of their new clients, an up-and-coming artist whose work had begun to gain recognition. He was eager to collaborate with them on a larger project, and the email was full of praise for the work Serafina and Sophie had done. It was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. Not just to build a business, but to make a difference in the lives of others, to support creativity and vision. She smiled as she read through the email, proud of the work they were doing and the path they were creating together. That afternoon, as Serafina sat at her desk, she received a call from Sophie. "Hey, I just wanted to check in," Sophie said. "How are you feeling about everything? The project with the artist is a big deal, and I want to make sure we're both on the same page." Serafina took a deep breath. She was ready for this. "I'm feeling good about it. I think we're headed in the right direction, but I also think we need to remember that we're in this together. We both bring something important to the table, and we need to keep supporting each other. No more shortcuts, no more excuses." "I agree," Sophie replied. "I'm ready to do this the right way." As they continued discussing the project, Serafina realized that this wasn't just a business venture. It was a reflection of everything they had learned. Trust, honesty, and growth were the foundation of their partnership. And it felt solid. No, it wasn't perfect, and there would still be bumps along the way, but Serafina knew that they could face them together. In the weeks that followed, the business continued to thrive. Serafina and Sophie learned to communicate better, to be open with each other about their concerns and challenges. They made mistakes, of course, but they faced them head-on, with respect, and a shared commitment to doing better. And with each step forward, Serafina felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had finally found the balance between personal growth and professional success. Looking back, Serafina realized that everything she had gone through had led her to this point. The betrayal, the heartache, the lessons learned, they had all shaped her into the person she was today. And while Sophie's mistakes had been painful, they had ultimately pushed Serafina to become stronger, to take control of her own life, and to build a future she could be proud of. And as the sun set on another day, Serafina smiled to herself, knowing that the journey was far from over. She had learned that the greatest success wasn't about business deals or achievements. It was about the way you treated yourself, the way you learned from your past, and the way you kept moving forward, no matter what. A few months later, Serafina found herself standing at the edge of a new chapter in her life. The business with Sophie had grown beyond anything they had initially imagined. Their partnership had proven more solid than she had expected, and their efforts were beginning to make a real difference in the art community. They were working with several artists now, helping them get their work shown at galleries, collaborating with other organizations that shared their values, and even beginning to work on their own art exhibitions. Serafina had learned to trust her instincts, to set the pace for what felt right, and to stand firm when necessary. The respect she had for herself and her boundaries had been the foundation of everything they had built. Yet, despite the progress, Serafina found herself grappling with an odd, lingering feeling. It wasn't fear of failure or doubt about the success of their venture. It was something deeper, more personal. She had changed. She had grown so much over the past few months, and as she watched Sophie continue to grow and develop, Serafina couldn't help but wonder if their friendship, the one they had rebuilt, had really changed enough for her to fully trust it again. It wasn't that she didn't care for Sophie anymore, but the truth was, their relationship had always been tangled in complicated emotions. The last few months had given Serafina a lot of space to think about what she wanted in her life moving forward. She had learned to prioritize her own happiness, to make decisions that were true to herself. But she hadn't fully come to terms with how she felt about her friendship with Sophie. The boundaries were clearer now, but there was still something holding her back. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Serafina sat on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. She had her cup of tea in hand, her thoughts drifting as the cool air brushed across her skin. It had been a day of new business opportunities and exciting developments, but there was something inside her that was unsettled. She knew that the next step in her journey wasn't about growing the business anymore. It was about understanding her own emotional landscape. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Sophie. "Hey Serafina, I've been thinking a lot. I want to talk. Can we meet tomorrow? Serafina stared at the message, her heart beating a little faster. She wasn't sure what Sophie wanted to discuss. Part of her wanted to ignore the message. After all, they had just worked together on their latest exhibition, and everything had seemed fine. But another part of her knew that this conversation was probably something she needed to have. She couldn't keep avoiding the difficult questions that lingered in the back of her mind. The next afternoon, Serafina met Sophie at a cafe they had visited countless times before. The atmosphere was calm, the kind of place that invited honest conversations. Sophie was already sitting at a corner table when Serafina arrived. Her expression was unreadable, but Serafina could see the tension in the way she held herself. As Serafina approached, Sophie stood up, offering a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming," Sophie said, her voice softer than usual. There was an unfamiliar vulnerability in her eyes, and Serafina couldn't help but wonder what was weighing on her friend. "Of course," Serafina replied, sitting down. She felt the air between them thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another meeting about the business. This was about something more. Sophie hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything we've been through, about where we are now, and I realized something that I think I need to share with you. This is hard for me to say, but I don't want to keep avoiding it." Serafina leaned forward slightly, waiting for Sophie to continue. "What's on your mind?" Sophie let out a long breath, her eyes meeting Serafina's with a mixture of apprehension and sincerity. "I think we've both changed so much, and I know I've been working hard to earn back your trust, to show you that I'm committed to this partnership. But there's something I need to admit. I've been holding on to something from the past, and I haven't really let go of it. Our friendship, it was always tied up in a lot of expectations. I wasn't just your friend. I was always trying to prove something, trying to be perfect, trying to be the one who had it all together." Serafina was silent for a moment, absorbing Sophie's words. She had always known that Sophie's confidence was often a mask for deeper insecurities. But hearing it out loud hit differently. She had spent so much time rebuilding their connection, so much time focusing on the business, that she hadn't fully realized how much emotional baggage Sophie was still carrying. "I didn't realize how much I was depending on you to fill the gaps for me," Sophie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I put so much pressure on you to be the steady one, the one who could always make things work. But I see now that I've been running away from my own issues, and I've relied on you too much to fix them. I'm sorry, Serafina. I don't want to keep leaning on you for everything. It's not fair to you." Serafina felt a mix of emotions surge through her. She had always known that Sophie was a complex person, but hearing her speak so openly about her struggles, her vulnerabilities, made Serafina see her in a new light. For the first time, Sophie wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't trying to manipulate or control the situation. She was simply being honest. "I don't know if we can go back to the way things were, Sophie," Serafina said softly, her words coming from a place of understanding rather than anger. "But I do appreciate what you're saying. It's not about me fixing things for you. It's about us both learning to take responsibility for our own lives. And that means not relying on each other to be perfect, or to always have the answers." Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I know I've messed up, but I want to keep working on myself. I don't expect you to fix anything for me anymore. I just want to be better for both of us." Serafina reached out, placing a hand gently on Sophie's. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie, but we need to keep moving forward. We can't keep looking back and expecting everything to fix itself. We have to work on the things that really matter, our actions, our choices, and most importantly, our ability to be honest with ourselves and each other." Sophie smiled, the weight of the moment lifting from her shoulders. "Thank you, Serafina. I think this is exactly what we both needed to hear." As they parted ways later that day, Serafina felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, both in her personal life and in her work with Sophie. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that they were both on the same page. They had reached a place of honesty, one that would help them move forward, not just as business partners, but as people who had learned to grow, to let go, and to rebuild something more solid than before. Serafina didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned that the most important thing in any relationship, whether with friends, family, or herself, was the ability to evolve, to face the truth, and to choose growth over perfection. And as she walked away from the cafe, Serafina knew she was ready for whatever came next, with or without Sophie by her side. As the weeks went by, Serafina began to notice subtle shifts within herself. The clarity she had been searching for, the space to feel at peace, was finally starting to settle into her life. She had learned how to separate herself from the expectations of others and focus on what she truly wanted. And it felt like she was stepping into a version of herself she hadn't fully known was there. Her partnership with Sophie had entered a new phase. It wasn't perfect, but it was rooted in something far stronger than before. They were finally starting to communicate with a level of honesty and mutual respect that hadn't been there in the past. The trust wasn't instant. It was a slow, consistent effort, and each small step forward felt like a victory. Sophie still had moments of insecurity, but Serafina had learned to recognize those moments not as manipulations, but as signs of growth. She no longer took it personally when Sophie faltered. She understood that everyone was doing their best to change. One afternoon, as they sat together at their office discussing an upcoming exhibition, Sophie turned to Serafina, a serious look on her face. "I've been thinking a lot about how far we've come. I know things haven't always been smooth, and I want to say thank you for sticking with me, for giving me a chance when I didn't deserve it." Serafina paused, surprised by the sincerity in Sophie's voice. It was the kind of conversation they hadn't had before, one that wasn't about business, but about acknowledgement and gratitude. "I didn't stick with you because I thought you'd change overnight," Serafina said softly. "I stuck with you because I believe in people's capacity to grow, and I wanted to see if we could build something that mattered, not just for us, but for everyone we're working with." Sophie nodded, clearly moved by the words. "I get that, and I think I'm finally starting to understand that building something meaningful takes time. And it starts with being honest with myself." As they continued talking about the exhibition, Serafina couldn't help but feel a sense of peace about their relationship. She had learned not to expect perfection, but growth. Sophie had been right about one thing. They had both changed, but that wasn't something to fear. It was something to celebrate. That evening, as Serafina returned home from work, she thought about the lessons she had learned over the past year. The pain of the past with Sophie was still there in some ways, but it no longer defined her. She had taken control of her own life and her emotions. For the first time in a long time, Serafina felt free, not just from the past, but from the pressure to always be the one who made things work. She had learned that true strength didn't lie in always fixing things. It was in knowing when to let go and when to stand firm. The next day, Serafina received an unexpected call from one of the artists they had helped earlier in the year. He wanted to thank her for the support she had given him, for the opportunities they had provided that allowed him to showcase his work to a wider audience. "I'm having my first solo exhibition," he said excitedly, "and I wanted to invite you to be a part of it. You're the reason I've gotten this far." Serafina smiled as she listened to him, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't just about the business deals or the success they had achieved. It was moments like this, when the impact of their work was seen and felt, that made everything worth it. It was the reason she had gotten into this business in the first place, to make a difference in people's lives. That evening, Serafina sat with a glass of wine, reflecting on the path she had taken. She had been through so much: loss, betrayal, the rebuilding of trust. And yet, here she was. She had come out the other side stronger, more sure of herself than she ever thought possible. She had learned how to trust her own instincts, how to set boundaries, and most importantly, how to let go of the things that no longer served her. Looking ahead, Serafina knew there would still be challenges. There would be times when Sophie would falter, when the business would face setbacks, or when doubts would creep in. But she also knew that she was equipped to handle whatever came next. She was no longer just an observer in her own life. She was an active participant, making choices based on her own needs, her own values. And as she thought about the future, she realized that it wasn't about avoiding pain or conflict. It was about learning to move through it, to grow from it, and to build something that was both meaningful and sustainable. With a smile, Serafina set her glass down and pulled out her sketchbook. It was time to start on a new project, one that was entirely her own. She had spent so much time helping others achieve their dreams, but now it was her turn. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. As Serafina picked up her pencil, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the lessons learned, for the people who had come and gone, and for the strength to move forward with a heart that was finally free from the weight of the past. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And in that moment, Serafina knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she would face it with confidence, with grace, and most importantly, with the peace of knowing that she was finally living life on her own terms. The months that followed were a time of true transformation for Serafina. She had built something strong with Sophie, a partnership that had weathered the storm of their past mistakes and emerged stronger for it. Yet, as Serafina continued to thrive both personally and professionally, she found herself reflecting more and more on the lessons the journey had taught her. It wasn't just about the success of their business or the projects they had completed. It was about the deeper truths she had discovered about herself. The art exhibitions they worked on became more than just displays of creativity. They were symbols of resilience, of growth, and of the ability to overcome obstacles. Serafina had come to realize that success wasn't just measured by how much money they made or how many people attended the events. Success to her now meant the ability to inspire others, to create change, and to remain true to oneself despite the world's expectations. One day, while reflecting on her journey, Serafina sat down in her apartment, looking out at the city skyline, her sketchbook in her lap. She thought about the years that had passed, about the people who had entered and exited her life, and about the quiet power she had discovered within herself. She had once believed that she had to rely on others for validation, for support, and even for love. But now she realized that she had everything she needed inside of her. She had always had it. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Sophie, as usual. "Hey, Serafina, I've been thinking about the direction we're taking with the business, and I want to discuss some new ideas. Can we meet up tomorrow?" Serafina smiled at the text. She had learned to see these messages not as obligations, but as opportunities for growth, both for the business and their evolving friendship. They had come so far, and while Serafina knew they still had a long way to go, she no longer feared what was to come. She felt ready to face whatever challenges they might encounter, knowing that she had the strength to handle them.
The next day, as Serafina sat across from Sophie in their favorite cafe, the air between them felt different, lighter, yet more grounded. Sophie's eyes were brighter than they had been in the past, and there was a warmth in her demeanor that hadn't always been there before. It was clear that Sophie had changed, but so had Serafina. They were no longer the same people they had been when they first started their journey together. They had learned the hard way that trust wasn't something that could be easily repaired, but they had rebuilt it, slowly, carefully, until it had become something strong and unbreakable. "I've been thinking about the future, Serafina," Sophie said, her voice more thoughtful than usual. "About how far we've come, but also how much more we can do. I don't want to just keep growing this business. I want to change the way people think about art, about the value of creativity in the world. I think we can make a bigger impact, but it's going to take everything we've learned, and everything we're still learning." Serafina listened intently, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. Sophie wasn't just talking about business anymore. She was talking about purpose. She was talking about a vision that went beyond profit and success. She was talking about legacy. "I agree," Serafina said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's about using what we've built to create something lasting, something that can change the way people see the world. Not just art, but the way we live, the way we treat each other, the way we build our futures." As they talked more, they made plans for the next phase of their business, one that would involve not just showcasing art, but also fostering a community of artists and creators who shared their vision. They wanted to provide a platform where people could come together, collaborate, and share their work with the world in meaningful ways. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face the challenges together. Later that evening, as Serafina walked home from their meeting, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had never imagined that a friendship so complicated, so filled with tension and mistakes, could evolve into something so beautiful. But that was the lesson she had learned, that nothing, no matter how broken, was beyond repair if the people involved were willing to put in the effort. It wasn't about perfection, it was about authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to grow. When Serafina arrived at her apartment, she took a moment to stand at the window, watching the world go by below. She thought about everything she had been through, everything she had learned. There were moments of heartache, of confusion, and of betrayal, but those moments had led her here, to a place of clarity, of inner peace, and of a future filled with possibility. For the first time in a long time, Serafina felt truly free. She had stopped looking for validation from others, stopped trying to prove her worth. She had learned to trust herself, to set boundaries, and to follow her own path. She knew that no matter what happened next, she was ready to face it. The road ahead was uncertain, but Serafina no longer feared the unknown. As she sat down at her desk, her sketchbook in front of her, Serafina picked up her pencil. She didn't need to know what the future held. She only needed to know that she was finally living her truth. The world was full of opportunities, and she was ready to take them all. And with that, Serafina smiled, feeling more alive than ever before. The journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning.